Greetings from Bangkok. Today, I will be discussing the École Française d'Extrême-Orient, André Malraux and Douglas Latchford, and their involvement in the sale of Khmer art. So I'll be showing a few maps, and then I'll be delving into the workings of the EFEO, followed by Malraux, perhaps the original tomb raider, and Douglas Latchford, a modern day trafficker. Then I will offer some considerations and the bibliography. Excellent. The maps are very important because they show commonality between the route that was used by Malraux about almost used by Malraux a century ago, and subsequently by Douglas Latchford in more recent decades. So Bante Sray is the temple that Malraux looted approximately be 100 years next year. And this is Kampong Chnang, the southern tip of Tonle Sap, where he was intercepted with his accomplices and his loot. And the route, which has now been in fact confirmed by a recent study by Mackenzie and Davis, several routes can be followed. Route 1, which is from Sisopon to Poipet, and then Aranya Pratet on the other side in Thailand, and it leads to Bangkok. Route 2 starts in Cambodia and Long Veng, via the Dang Rek Mountains, Kunan, Kantaralak, and again to Bangkok. And then there is a third sea route, not shown here, from the Cambodian port to Sihanoukville, from there to Singapore, and finally to Bangkok. We used to say that all roads lead to Rome, but here all roads lead to Bangkok, actually. I will now discuss the numerous pieces of legislation enacted by the French colonial government ostensibly to protect Indochina's cultural heritage. This museum became the repository of objects collected from excavations in Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, which is quite a beautiful museum and houses a fantastic collection. Let's start with the EFEO. The École Française d'Extrême-Orient, or the EFEO, French School of Asian Studies, was established in 1898 to research Asia's languages, cultures, religions, and architecture. The Indologist epigrapher, Auguste Barthes, who drafted the EFEO's foundation charter in 1901, encouraged the institution to safeguard Indochina's cultural heritage. Indeed, he exhorted EFEO members to keep Indochina's riches within Indochina. He opposed the relocation of artifacts to the Khmer Museum in Paris and admonished against temptation to restore artifacts. So, of course, a lot of this flew out the window almost straight away. And here we have the Khmer Museum over the years. As you can see, a very rich collection. These are different rooms. By 1908, it was already quite well staffed, actually, quite well populated, sorry, with Khmer antiques. This image is from 1938, and here in 2006, and then 2009. As you can see, a fantastic collection. State legislation allowed Indochina's colonial government to ship Khmer treasures to museums in France. To the 53 Khmer artifacts shipped in 1927 from Phnom Penh's Albert Sarong Museum, a further haul of Khmer statuary followed in 1931. The next few slides will summarize legislation enacted ostensibly to protect Indochina's cultural heritage. I'm going to be moving fairly quickly through these slides because they're a little bit, I wouldn't say heavy, but perhaps pedantic, but they do prove the point of how much legislation was available then and how it failed to protect so many, thousands of Khmer artifacts, either being sold, exchanged, given as gifts, or just barefaced looted. Legislation was enacted as early as March 1900 with the decree issued by Indochina's Governor General Paul Doumer for the protection of monuments of historical or artistic value. Article 4 specifically forbade the destruction, repair, or modification of monuments without the Governor General's written consent. More legislation followed in December 1913, allowing the colonial government discretion for the application of the decree for antiquities under their jurisdiction. The April 1920 decree was particularly important because the EFEO assumed responsibility for ensuring the preservation of the historical monuments of French Indochina. The EFEO became increasingly concerned with budget shortfalls and raising sufficient funds to protect Indochina's artistic treasures. Now, this is probably the most important piece of legislation enacted on the 14th of February 1923, which was just a few months before Malraux was caught with his artifacts trying to leave Cambodia in December, in fact, on Christmas Eve, 1923. This decree was introduced, as I said, a few months before Malraux's looting of Bantes Rey. The EFEO and the colonial government authorized themselves to sell Khmer artifacts to overseas buyers under certain conditions. And only after such sales were approved by the Director of Cambodian Arts and the Conservator for Angkor. Under this condition, what the conditions were that if they had several items or one particular statue, if the statue was not, perhaps it was dented, it was damaged, it couldn't be shown in a museum. So these were the conditions, but very quickly, these conditions were relaxed, to say the least. On the 31st of July, 1931, the decree of 14 February 1923 was repealed, and the EFEO began selling Khmer art from hotels and bungalows in Siem Reap, which is the center where all of us go for the Cambodian temples. The sale of Khmer artifacts between 5 to 30 piastre, that would be equivalent to about $4.5 up to $27, continued until June 1938, when a lintel destroyed during transport ended the EFEO's hotel partnership. The French school became the sole trader of Khmer artifacts at higher prices. What they did was, when the EFEO became the sole trader of Khmer artifacts, they increased their prices by the 20% commission they had previously paid to intermediaries, that is the hotels, bungalows, and so on in Siem Reap. As they say, nice work if you can get it. Only the curator of Angkor, his wife, and his secretary were entitled to sell Khmer art. The EFEO and the French colonial government sold Khmer antiquities for various reasons, to raise funds for conservation work and to fight increased theft by tourists. These are some of the reasons they put forward. In their logic, it could prevent the production of fakes. By selling originals, you could prevent the production of fakes. There was strong demand from art lovers, so they had to sell in order to meet that demand by legal means. However, recent studies argue that the theft of Khmer artifacts, in fact, increased after 1923. In this slide, which I have adapted from a very good study by Pierre Singer-Ravelou, you can see there are literally close to 1,000 of artifacts sold for next to nothing. Altogether, they probably scrounged together not even $77,000 in those days for 976 artifacts at least. Now, this table excludes hundreds of artifacts shipped to museums in France and a very sizable exchange with the Museum of Tokyo that I will show to you very, very quickly. So more legislation followed on the 23rd of December 1924 out of concern for increased looting by tourists. In October 1929, the decree of 14th of February 1923, which was limited to Cambodian antiquities. So in October 1929, the sale of artifacts included objects from Annam, which is the central part of Vietnam. And here, as I said, is this infamous exchange with the Museum of Tokyo in Japan. Now, at that time, this happened in mid-1944. So that was when we had the Vichy government in France. And of course, that extended to Cambodia and Imperial Japan. So in the winter of 1944, literally crates of Khmer artifacts were shipped to the Tokyo Museum in Japan. A total of 69 Angkorian masterpieces comprised of sculptures, ancient metal objects, and ceramics. By the way, I got this PDF from the Tokyo Museum. They were quite open about it, so I was grateful to get their information. And this is from their page. As you can see, they make no bones about it. It was acquired through exchange with the École Française d'Extrême-Orient. And this, they have a description of what the material consists of. And every few years or so, the Tokyo Museum has an exhibition of their Khmer collection. In this slide, we see André Malraux and his two accomplices. They were accomplices. In fact, his wife, Clara Goldschmidt, she was more so of an accomplice than the other accomplice, Louis Chevasson. He was probably a simple man. She escaped legal proceedings, even though she masterminded the operation with André, her husband. But Louis Chevasson got caught up in it and was tried together with Malraux. This is a picture shortly after the marriage of André with Clara Goldschmidt. André and Louis met at primary school in 1907, and by all accounts, they were lifelong friends. Chevasson literally got roped into it, or whatever, out of loyalty, we don't know. Malraux was born in Paris in November 1901. He was the son of an old executive. He was a precocious and gifted writer who was a published writer by the age of 20. He had his own inimitable style, which some people like, but some people find difficult to read. He used deception to loot statues from Bantes Rey. The experience in Indochina left him so traumatized, so to speak, that he became a fierce anti-colonial Frenchman. He wrote a fictionalized account of the looting, La Voie Royale, which he published in 1930, but it is really not a, I would say, a dutiful account. It's really mixed with fiction and all sorts of other things. He became culture minister for France in 1959 for the next 10 years under the presidency of General de Gaulle. Louis Chevasson was born in Bourgogne in eastern France. Like André, he grew up in Paris. He was not involved in the looting, but was tried for it together with André. And now André's wife, Clara Goldschmidt, she came from a wealthy Jewish family from Germany, spoke several languages, and I would say she was at least André's intellectual match. She masterminded the Bantes Rey looting with André, but she never saw the inside of a courtroom in Cambodia or Vietnam. She published an account of the looting in 1966, which is actually, I recommend it. It's not been translated into English, whereas La Voie Royale, André's account, is available in English, but Clara's, which is a candid account, really, it's a blow by blow, how they planned the looting and how they went about it, but it's available only in French. Some of the pictures, I'm afraid I've had to put a banner because they're covered by copyright. These are documents that I obtained very recently. In October 1923, Malraux obtained a letter of recommendation from the Minister for Colonies in Paris for a self-funded archaeological mission to Cambodia, supported, at least that's what he said in the letter, that Malraux, André, could support this expedition through a personal fund of 100,000 to 200,000 French francs, or approximately between $6,000 and $12,000 in today's money. They sailed from Marseille shortly after, in fact, on the 5th of October, and a month later, they went to the offices of the EFEO in Hanoi, where they handed over the letter from the Minister for Colonies, and in return obtained a bona fide excavation permit that would allow him to conduct some excavations in certain areas, but there were restrictions to what he could do. The Malraux and Chevasson traveled from Hanoi to Siem Reap, where they purchased hammers and stone saws and proceeded to dismantle sections of the South Tower of Bantesray in order to cut blocks decorated with devatas. On the return journey from Siem Reap, they traveled by boat but were intercepted at Kampong Chinan, as we saw in map 1. They were allowed to proceed to Phnom Penh, where they were formally charged and ordered to remain in the capital under house arrest. The crates with the looted artifacts were confiscated.
Lia, I'll give you 5 or so more minutes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah,
sorry, how many minutes?
5 or so more minutes.
Okay, very good. These are some of the artifacts looted by Malraux from Bantesray, the devatas on the left and the 2 rishis on the right. And this is an image of a dilapidated Bantesray in January 1924, immediately after Malraux's looting. Now, Malraux did not do all this looting. The temple was in a very, very dilapidated state. And this is what convinced Malraux to go there and help themselves to what he could. This is an interview with Malraux. In this article published on the 16th of September, 1924, now by then, Malraux had been tried in Phnom Penh in July 1924. So this was published in September after the trial and before the appeal, which was heard in Saigon in October 1924. Malraux argued that Bantesray was not a temple, but a cluster of stones, ruins from which his friend Chevasson had collected some broken bas-reliefs. This was an outright lie because, as I said earlier, as soon as they got to Siem Reap, they purchased hammer stones and saws with which to do their demolition work. The writer of the article contests Malraux's defense lawyer, who argued the principle of res nullius in court, defining Bantesray as a monument without owner, which could be legally claimed by occupying it. By his own admission, after looting Bantesray, Malraux planned to meet a member of the Thai elite to buy a large art collection for $50,000 for onward sale to an American collector. Now let us look at Douglas Latchford, a modern day trafficker perhaps. He's the late Douglas Latchford. He was born in Bombay in 1931 to English parents. He was educated in England, but returned to India prior to independence, which was very shortly, 15th of August in 1947. In the mid-1950s, he moved to Thailand, where he was briefly married to a Thai woman and had a daughter, Julia Latchford. In Thailand, Latchford set up a pharmaceutical business, which he had started in India years earlier, and also became involved in bodybuilding, investing heavily in land holdings. He became a Thai citizen in 1968 and later was also granted Cambodian citizenship following a large donation to the National Museum in Cambodia. In 2004, with Emma Banka, he published Adoration and Glory, the Golden Age of Khmer Art. Many believe that, in fact, he was trying to legitimize the artifacts of dubious provenance that was in his possession, because he had 2 homes, one in Bangkok and one in London. Latchford started collecting Khmer art in the early 1970s when Cambodia was under Khmer Rouge rule, facilitating the looting and smuggling of antiquities from Cambodia to rural Thailand and Bangkok, as we saw in map 2. He sold and donated art to leading museums around the world, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. He is on record as saying that he may have been the rightful owner of his collection in a past life, believing he was a Khmer in a previous life. In 2019, the US indicted Latchford for looting and fraud, but he fought extradition and agreed to return some of his collection to Cambodia. Shortly after his death in Bangkok in August 2020, Julia Latchford entered into formal negotiations to return her father's collection to Cambodia. Negotiations are ongoing and are expected to be lengthy. The Cambodian government needs to find space for these returned objects and find all the necessary resources. Moreover, there are difficulties in preparing export documentation for unprovenanced items. In this image, we see some of the Khmer artifacts arriving in Cambodia, returned by Latchford's family. The collection in the Latchford family is believed to number around 125 pieces made from stone and bronze, housed in his homes in Bangkok and London, and with a market value of at least $50 million. In January 2022, it was reported that objects acquired by some American collectors through negotiations involving, or shall we say, negotiations facilitated by Latchford, are being returned to Cambodia. One such item is the 8-arm radiating Lokeshvara in sandstone, one of 28 Khmer artifacts voluntarily handed over to the authorities in the USA by American tech billionaire James H. Clark. This object, in fact, is illustrated in Bunker and Latchford's Adoration and Glory.
Lia, maybe 1 or 2 more minutes just to wrap it up. Thank you.
And coming to the conclusion, I have prepared a table where you can see the colonial government passed its own laws to sell Khmer artifacts. In addition, they sold, gifted, exchanged countless Khmer artifacts. That was my point. A law unto the EFEO was a law unto itself. They also exchanged Khmer artifacts with Imperial Japan out of political affiliation. Cambodia was a protectorate, unlike Cochin China, which was the only colony in French Indochina. So by selling and gifting and exchanging Cambodia's treasures, the EFEO and the French colonial government failed in their duty to safeguard Cambodia's cultural heritage. Moving to the right, Malraux and Latchford, they used the same escape route of Siam or Thailand. They had local accomplices as state sponsors for sure. They both showed lack of contrition and believed that they were the savers of the Khmer heritage. They were knights in shining armor. They both claimed a passion for Khmer art. Whereas Malraux never denied looting, Latchford resisted extradition to the US. Malraux went on trial, but Latchford passed away before his case went to court. Malraux's looted artifacts were intercepted and never left Cambodia. However, both Malraux and Latchford aggrandized themselves because Malraux, as I said, became France's culture minister, and Latchford became wealthy and internationally famous in his lifetime. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lia.